This will be a grim assessment. This will be a very grim assessment. And this is not me saying Russia should do this. This is not me moralizing or anything like that. In fact, I often say, in context of wars, good, bad usually doesn't necessarily apply. It's cause and effect. And this is no different. This video is kind of pointing out just where the analysis, at least for me, in the way that I frame this, leads. And where it seems to inexorably lead is to Russia having to basically mobilize. I know that's not necessarily something they wanted to do, but whether they want to do it or not, the conditions that they are presented with and confronted with are basically forcing them down a very specific pathway. It is a Hobbesian choice. In fact, all of this was a Hobbesian choice. If you go back to Niet means Niet, right here, William Burns, director of CIA. Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement in efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which could seriously affect Russia's security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community being against, could lead to a major split involving violence or at worst a civil war. At eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. That is William Burns 10 years ago, who basically is describing exactly what took place now. And the situation, again, civil war, but keep in mind how that civil war was stoked, provoked, and how neo-Nazis were basically used almost as a tip of a spear. And in order to remove the democratically elected government of Ukraine in 2014, the Yanukovych government. My point here is unpredictable, uncontrolled consequences. And that is where we are. That is exactly and precisely where we are. Meaning this quaint war that Moscow wanted to have, this special operation, as they call it, they can accomplish most of the objectives. But there's one that you can't necessarily accomplish without the assistance of the person to which you are fighting. And therein lies the rub. I want to explain why I think that regardless of what Moscow wants, regardless of the political consequences that comes with it, they may not have a choice but to mobilize. Grim and yet unpredictable consequences. This video is an explanation of why. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. Definitely hit like on the video. I'm going to try to explain this in a way I see it. And if you guys have a different assessment, definitely put it in the box below. I often read the comments on the videos. But in my head, I got to be honest, I don't quite see how Moscow gets out of this without having some level of a full mobilization of its military forces. Let's start here. Moscow decides, all right, they're not going to fulfill the Minsk agreements. NATO has continued to expand. They knocked over the democratically elected government of Yanukovych using basically Nazis to do it and turned this government as this kind of proxy for the United States to affect its particular will on a border of Russia, using these militias to basically call these guys terrorists, or at this point, the Ukrainian government, to go after the Russian-speaking or the ethnic Russian Ukrainians that are in the East. Now, in that situation, where you are basically saying, I need you to say you won't be part of NATO and you won't be aligned, and nobody would say it. So you basically engage in a war based on real, legitimate security interests that none of these other forces cared about, and not just not cared about, precipitated this crisis just because of all the things that I outlined prior. I outlined those things, and I point to the William Burns thing because all of them understood that this was a red line. All of them did. All of them continued that particular action, even going up to the point of rah-rahing a crowd to overthrow the government, giving resources, money, training, etc., to basically neo-Nazis in order to pull this off. Yeah, if you are Russia and you're looking at this, you will have security concerns. Considering the United States was willing to end the world over the Cuban Missile Crisis, you would think that some of these people would kind of remember that. If Russia knocked over the government of Mexico and then started putting weapons, trainers, mercenaries, integrating them into some kind of larger military thing and pointing that stuff at the United States, do you believe that the United States will acquiesce to that? Do you think they will be okay with that? Do you think they would tolerate that? And considering we saw the response when the missiles were going into Cuba, then of course they wouldn't tolerate that. But again, the moment that it is flipped to somebody you don't particularly like, that context, that understanding entirely goes out the window. So fine, Russia engages in a war in order to deal with its security interests that the other powers not just didn't care about, but in some respects, again, egged on in order to create this Hobbesian choice that William Burns mentioned. Do you allow yourself to be encircled, a military fait accompli if any particular conflict takes off? Or do you get involved in an unpredictable situation in order to secure your own military and security interests? Any sovereign state would do number two and get involved because no sovereign state would allow themselves to be surrounded by enemies where any conflict is a fait accompli, especially when they themselves can provoke a conflict and have a decisive advantage based on positioning alone. All of them knew it. So Russia says, fair enough. Our objectives are very specific. We're going to have a short campaign, special operation, ensure the security of the Donbass republics. The Crimea is Russian territory, period. Establish a land bridge to the Crimea, degrade the Ukrainian military armament or army or military up until the point where it no longer can be used as basically a throat to the neck of Moscow. Denazify the country. That's a little bit more esoteric, I suppose. And once all of that is accomplished, and I think I've said before, sue for peace. Meaning, accomplished objectives militarily on the ground. We got what we wanted. Now we're going to sue and let's scuttle this. We've beaten them. We've did what we wanted to do. Now you can accomplish all of those objectives with the exception of 5 by yourself. Meaning, the first 4 are basically tests of strength. How strong are you? And do you have the will basically to use this kind of muscular military in order to accomplish those objectives on the ground? Yes. 5, however, is the rub. And 5 is the exact reason why this plan is not ultimately going to work. What do I mean by that? When Russia went in, they didn't go in a way that the United States went into a country. Meaning this kind of scorched earth policy. They went in, special operation. They're not going to destroy rail. They're not going to destroy infrastructure. They're not going to destroy buildings. They're not going to just kind of randomly bomb all of these places. It is very specific and narrow and focused. Don't take my word for it. Even Western publications noticed that right here. Putin's bombers could devastate Ukraine, but he's holding back. Here's why. Now, of course, it's going to be farcical because it's Western press. But right here, this part is part of importance. The destruction is massive, a senior analyst working at the Defense Intelligence Agency tells Newsweek, especially when compared to what Europeans and Americans are used to seeing. But, the analyst says, the damage associated with the contested ground war involving peer opponents shouldn't blind people to what is really happening. The analyst requested anonymity. He couldn't say this. He couldn't disclose his identity and say what he was about to say. He says, quote, the heart of Kiev is barely touched, and almost all of the long-range strikes have been aimed at military targets. In the capital, the most observable, the West Kiev City, authorities say that some 55 buildings have been damaged and 222 people have died since February 24th. It is a city of 2.8 million people. Quote, we need to understand Russia's actual conduct, says the retired Air Force officer, a lawyer in training who has been involved in approving targets for U.S. fights in Iraq and Afghanistan. The lawyer currently works as an analyst for a large military contractor, advising the Pentagon was granted anonymity in order to speak candidly. If we merely convince ourselves that Russia is bombing indiscriminately or that it is failing to inflict more harm because of personnel are not set up to the task or because it is not technically inept, then we are not seeing the real conflict. His point is, look, if they wanted to devastate this, they could do that. They're making a choice, political, military, whatever you want to call it, not to do that. This is something even the New York Times noticed. Now, mind you, again, they come to a farcical conclusion to some of this stuff, but at least they get it. But quietly, some military analysts and Western officials are asking why the onslaught hasn't been even worse. Because they get, on some level, Russian capability versus what is taking place on the ground. Now, of course, this stuff had to expand because of the weapons and everything else that was being dropped into it, but that was the basic objective a narrow, quaint conflict. Number 5, sue for peace. And that's the issue. How do you sue for peace if there is nobody who's there that's willing to accept that suing for peace? How do you end the war? That's the dilemma, right? You accomplish your military objectives. Great. You have the Donbass in hand. Great. How do you stop it? Meaning, how do you consolidate your gains in a way where you can end this conflict? The Donbass republics are safe, the Crimea Bridge is safe, and there's no military hostilities still taking place. There's a new security architecture of Europe, and everybody goes about their way. How do you do that? How do you do that? And that's the rub. I have no idea how you do that. Zelensky is not looking for peace terms, and not just not looking for peace terms. From the standpoint, you have one or two things that you can do to end the war. Either you take Ukraine, meaning you expand the conflict into the east, or you find somebody where you can talk to in order to create and negotiate terms. If you cannot find anybody to negotiate terms, you're stuck with the first one. That's the point that I'm getting at. How do you end the war? It is true that Russia is accomplishing its objectives. That is very true. They are taking territory. Very true. They are securing the regions that they want to. Very true. How do you end it? And not just end it, but end it with those gains in hand. And that is the rub. How do you engage in peace talks after accomplishing your mission objectives if the other person never accepts defeat, never wants to negotiate, and decides, based on his own framing of the world, that he doesn't need to, that he can entirely lose the Donbass region? Because from his standpoint, as long as it takes Russia to do the Donbass region, I can use that time of those people that are basically dying in order to solidify what is taking place in the West. Many of the weapons that are being shipped into Ukraine, where are they going? Well, Russia has started destroying railway lines, let's say fuel depots, because the objective is to keep those weapons outside of the theater of war. Okay, but if those weapons are still in the West, what does it mean from the standpoint of being able to create a power center? And not just a power center. As you get more and more weapons in from NATO, as they get more sophisticated, as NATO gives you more and more weaponry, do you create a power center in the West? And a power center in such a way where you can lose the Donbass region and still, on some level, have a consolidated source of power where you can even potentially think of counterattacks into the Donbass region. What I'm getting at is, if there is no means of negotiating a settled peace, and the other side is basically accruing power while you destroy the main military in the theater of war, and for however long it takes you to destroy and to take the Donbass region, that is that much more time for Zelensky to get his people trained, to get conscripts, to get new equipment from NATO, to get resources from NATO, maybe even to get NATO to give more sophisticated equipment, more logistics, more intelligence, et cetera, meaning the longer that takes, you can almost on some level accept the Donbass is going to be lost. My 15,000 troops there, they're going to be lost. I accept that. I can still wage war. And so I am not in a position where I need to do terms. And not just not do terms. I am still having aspirations and plans on taking that territory back. Meaning, even if you can take all of the regions that you want to and accomplish all of your military objectives, there is still a threat beyond the horizon of your force capability that you have to deal with, especially since part of your mission is securing those regions. And how can those regions ever be secure if there is another power center and another threat with all sorts of military weaponry and everything else that is chomping at the bit for the opportunity to regain that territory and not, under any circumstance, come to terms? How do you do it? That seems like a dilemma to me. Meaning, I don't know how you extricate yourself from the war even after you get what you want in the context of the war. And again, like I said, Zelensky's plan in this, I know some people were thinking in the beginning, and I think I was too, okay, if Russia takes the Donbass region, then what? Then of course he would have to sue for peace. I mean, the military objective would be accomplished. But then, why? Why does he have to do that? Why? Isn't it true that the more time he has to train his troops, to get conscripts, and to get more NATO weaponry, to get that much more logistics and, let's say, integrated support in order to create a hard point from the standpoint of the West? The answer is yes. The answer is of course. And from the standpoint of NATO, they're giving these guys more and more weaponry right here. U.S. intelligence is helping Ukraine kill Russian generals. Now, Kirby said that's not true, but okay, keep going. U.S. intelligence helping Ukraine strike Russian flagships. Now, whether Kirby is trying to dance between the raindrops in the way that he's saying, we didn't give them information to kill generals, you did give them information. Nobody is stupid enough to believe that you aren't giving them logistical assistance and intelligence on where people, items, objects, etc. are going to be. You are basically running a proxy war at this point. You're giving $40 billion. The EU is giving another $15 billion. You're giving all the weapons that you can get your hands on. You signed the Lend-Lease bill. Do you believe that Russia is somehow unaware that you are supplying this particular information in order to kill as many Russians as possible? Do you believe they're unaware that NATO has accepted this kind of grim calculus that it is better for us to spend dollars because every dollar we give is another Russian that is dead? And from our standpoint, the degradation of that particular power center is exactly what we want. We are targeting Russia. So yeah, paying money for it is a good gamble for us. That's the way they're framing that. That's the way they're looking at that. And so they are basically making decisions and pushing Zelensky on some level to make decisions that they themselves are not necessarily having to deal with. However, whatever dollar they give, it basically comes back in the blood of somebody else on that battlefield. They are separate from the decisions that they are making, or separate from the consequences of the decisions that they're making. Yes, economic, and yes, that will lead to political. But I'm talking about from the standpoint of blood and the people who are being killed because these guys are dumping that many weapons into the battle zone. And fact of the matter is, at some point, here's another one. Ukrainian officials, U.S. devising plan to destroy Russian Black Fleet. You have the entire West that has decided to align itself against you. And you have a force that went into Ukraine for the very specific military objectives that you wanted to accomplish. And my point is, even if you accomplish those objectives, then what? If the other person doesn't want to stop, and not just not stop, the longer and the more time they get to be able to consolidate some kind of, let's say, wall of force that they could potentially use as a base of operations for potential counterattacks and incursions back into the east. The longer that takes, the more weapons they get, the more training they get, the more sophisticated that particular military and those conscripts get. You may take the Donbass. My point is, it doesn't end the war. That's the point that I am getting at. Their overall objective of trying to keep this to a limited conflict ultimately fails because that requires somebody else to either negotiate with, or that requires you basically taking and destroying the entirety of the military in such a way where you can basically run the table on terms. The force is limited that Moscow is basically introduced into the conflict. So it doesn't necessarily have the capability to take it all, and yet it doesn't have the capability of ending the war either. What do you do with this? This seems to be a dilemma to me. This is kind of what I'm getting at. This is not me saying X should take place or Y should take place. It almost seems like, almost by force of logic, it has to take place. From the standpoint of Moscow, this is existential. Consider the ramifications if Moscow loses this. Meaning this test of strength that is taking place where all of these NATO nations have basically provoked a conflict and then align themselves in such a way to put as much pressure as possible in order to destroy and degrade the Russian military. Not just that, the country itself, in the stated objectives of, we want to destroy the Russian economy. And on top of that, you get Lloyd Austin out there saying, we want to destroy and degrade the Russian military. Something similar as in Afghanistan. But this is not Afghanistan. This is not Afghanistan. And not just that, this is on the border of Russia. These Western nations are willing to destroy themselves economically, to get across. Yes, for Ukraine, it is also existential in a literal sense. For Russia, it is existential in a literal sense. The ramifications of losing are astonishing. You basically end up with a fight for your particular security, and you lose that fight for that particular thing, meaning that objective of your own security. The issue of NATO, from the standpoint of Ukraine, whether it's done indeed, meaning in fact, or whether it's done de facto, it's gotten across that you have lost the capacity to do anything about it militarily. You couldn't do squat to stop it. It is hard to get across the ramifications, not to mention the vulnerability that is there after losing a conflict like that. That is off the table. And so if that is off the table, And you need the ability to end this conflict. You need the ability to consolidate your gains. You have the entirety of the West that are willing to destroy themselves economically in order to do and beat you. Because let's be honest, from the standpoint of the West, this is also on some level, at the very least esoterically, existential. I mean, in their heads, this is the last stand of Western hegemony. This is the last gasp of the unipolar world. And from their standpoint, they're there trying to exert and show that they still have this capability of dominance, whether it's economic or whether it's militarily, in order to dictate events around the globe, whether that's knocking over countries, whether it's putting leaders in particular places, or for that matter, whether that's provoking certain wars. I mean, I guess my point here is, for them, this is that crisis point where a degrading, let's say, hegemon is being confronted and challenged with a new reality. And that new reality is this is no longer a unipolar world. And for as long as they want to believe that it is, they're going to come into hard, let's say, edges with reality itself. They're willing to damage themselves. And so if they're willing to damage themselves to that extent, and they're willing to put this much money into Ukraine, again, how do you end this conflict? And that's, I guess my point is this. There are only two ways. Take Ukraine, smash the military, sue for peace at the point where they can't do anything about it, one way or the other. Or you come to terms. If you can't come to terms because of all of the forces that are allied against you, all of the European leaders that are pushing Zelensky to keep on going, all of the weapons and the money and everything else that creates an incentive to basically keep on going, to drag more men and children into training and whatnot in order to fight the Russian military. If they're going to create a strong point in the West, how do you end this? And that's why I keep coming to the conclusion that it just seems like full mobilization at some point is a given and is somewhat of a must. There's no way to know what systems these guys are going to get, or for that matter, how long it would take to integrate those systems in such a way that it can change the context on the ground. And mind you, again, just because Russia may take the Donbass region, it doesn't necessarily mean that the war is over, and more likely does not mean it's over at all. You can never consolidate your gains without dealing with whatever that power center is that is still there, that is still considered to be a threat, and is still openly hostile and wanting to take the territory back. Then you can never consolidate your gains in the context of having something like that. But you don't have the scope, the force necessary, or the ability for that particular force to spread beyond what it can do or what its own capabilities are. Which means, what do you do in this situation? Can't just go home. You don't have the ability, at least, to go into the West. At least I don't think you do. I mean, Russia didn't necessarily seem to have huge force in Ukraine for this particular conflict. And if you can't do any of those things, and the longer it takes for you to make a choice on what you do, is that much more time where they can consolidate and regenerate their particular military in a different part or a different theater. It almost seems like your hand is forced. It almost seems like your hand is forced. Peace seems to be off the table at this point. Yeah, like I said, this isn't a rah-rah and yeah, this should be done and everything else. It's not that. It's more so looking at this in this kind of grim military analysis of, okay, well, what do you do in this situation? You got what you wanted, or you're getting what you wanted. Let's say you get what you want entirely. Will Zelensky surrender? Negotiate for peace? No, he won't. And by the way, whether or not you can get your peace terms immediately is almost secondary to the point that you would still need to be able to show in real brimming terms that you can basically effect the battlefield in such a way where it is definitive that the other side has to come to terms. But at this point, keep in mind, that wasn't necessarily the thing that they wanted to do. I guess my thing is the quaint war is admirable, but in this case, you have unforeseen consequences. That those unforeseen consequences is the other side doesn't want to give up. If he doesn't want to give up, what do you do? And does that necessitate on some level you being able to expand the horizon of the campaign that you are basically waging in order to deal with the secondary power center that is being developed in the West? If that is true, does that necessitate mobilization on some level? I get the politics are unpalatable. I get that's not necessarily something anybody wants to do. But again, the politics being unpalatable is secondary to the realistic or the real life phenomena of stakes and what this means. And the stakes in this case, especially from the standpoint of Russia, cannot be understated. Losing is not something that can necessarily be an option. And this idea of like parity of forces and everything, that is not the point. The point is to win. And the catch is, under the current conditions, winning while maintaining this as a quaint war doesn't necessarily seem to be on the table. At the very least, I don't necessarily see any alternatives associated with it, where you can keep the quaint war, by the same token, consolidate your gains and extricate yourself from this conflict. The dilemma is you're basically stuck. How do you get unstuck? And it seems that the only way you can get unstuck is through military might. It feels weird. Like kind of making the point or explaining the logic behind it. But again, I don't necessarily see a way out. And that's kind of where I am with that. I was talking to the people on the team. I was asking them the same thing. Like, is my thinking wrong on this? Like, what am I missing here? How do you extricate yourself from this conflict without necessarily mobilizing in such a way where you could basically win the war? And is it possible to win the war with the forces that you already have? If that answer is no, it is not possible to win the war with the force you have. And B, you have nobody on the other side that is willing to have peace terms. And C, on top of that, the longer this basically takes, the more time it gives for your adversary to catch his breath, to reconsolidate power in the West, and to organize this notion of potential counterattack with more sophisticated weaponry that they're getting from NATO. Given these terms, where you have a world of the West basically putting as much weight as possible on you, can you maintain the quaint war? Can you maintain the quaint war? I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe.